So on to today. We're talking about customer development, and I'd like to welcome David Chan. David, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us about your background and experience?
Hello there. I guess I'm a serial entrepreneur. I've started multiple companies. I've worked here in the UK and in Silicon Valley. I currently live in Leicester and have a blockchain startup that we just started a month ago. So we're fairly early in our journey, but I've done multiple startups and I guess yeah. So today we'll just have a chat about customer development. It's something that I learned while I was out in Silicon Valley before all the books came out on it. Um, so yeah, back to you, Ben.
Oh, yeah. So looking at the three workshops today, I was joking with Sam earlier that ours was the last and looked like the least sexy of the three. But the reality is that if you don't do customer development right, doing sales, trying to do sales or marketing or investment is probably a wasted time. Would you agree?
Yeah,
It,
yeah,
it's
that's
the
true.
it's the key. It's the most fundamental thing to working out whether your business idea is worth pursuing. And I think a lot of people perhaps think that they can somehow skip that or can just trade based on the assumptions that they've made. So I wondered if you could talk in a little bit more detail about what customer development actually means and what does it achieve for an early stage startup.
Yeah, so I guess the term was invented by somebody called Steve Blank, who's the father of the lean startup methodology. And now he actually wrote a book on this. I can't remember when it was published, but it's basically four stages. And so customer development is customer discovery, customer validation, customer creation, and then company growth, I guess. Um, and but a lot of this talk is actually on the first phase and second phase. But the first phase, there's also um, Rob Fitzpatrick wrote a really good book on called the Mum Test that covers how to talk to customers. So that customer discovery bit, which is the earlier stage, will be is basically what we're going to cover in this talk.
Right. And for the benefit of viewers, the MOM test, spelled American spelling of MOM, MOM, by Rob Fitzpatrick is a really, really good book. I only read it a couple of years ago, which I'm embarrassed to say was probably about 10 years too late, but a really, really good read. And if you've ever tried to do this before, or if you've tried to sell a product to customers prematurely, you read this book, you will quickly see where where you were going wrong. So I thoroughly recommend it. And as David said, we're going to try and cover much of what that talks about. So my first question about customer development, I guess, is what does it actually look like, and when do you do it?
So I guess you do it as early as possible. As soon as you have an idea for something, you try and validate that with people around you, or I guess initially you'll be people that you know, but eventually you have to try and reach people that would actually use the software.
You talked about people that you know, and I guess the idea, the name of the book, the Mum Test, is kind of playing on the idea that if you ask your mum whether she thinks it's a good business idea or not, she's going to give you an answer which probably isn't truthful or useful because she loves you and she doesn't want to embarrass you or disappoint you, right? So talking to people who don't necessarily have any emotional attachment to you or indeed don't know you is usually the right thing, yeah?
Yeah, so I guess the book goes into the even if you do talk to your mum, make sure you embed the questions in historic occurrence. Don't. So typically you should never say things like, do you like this idea, or do you think it'll work? Would you
Yeah.
ever buy this? Um, just don't try and get to the roots of the problem and look at historically how they have coped with that problem, if they have.
So
Um,
if the potential answer to your question can be, it's lovely, dear, you're you're probably asking the wrong question, right? Um, so it's something to do really early on. can you tell me a little bit about how you've done it historically? How have you solicited those initial conversations with prospective customers? What routes have you taken to get those conversations?
So I guess two routes. One, you use your network. You use people that you know, and you sort of do custom development on them, and then at the end, hopefully they will know somebody that you can talk to. So that's one way of doing it.
So
The
those people might help you partly kind of as a warm-up act, I suppose, but also then to make good connections from genuine strangers.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
I think that the sort of the contacts that I have, because they're in the startup ecosystem and they know about this, they will ask me hard questions anyway, right from the get-go.
right,
So, but then they will refer me on to other people who are closer to being a customer, and so that's the route number one. The second route is I attend a lot of meetups. So you know, I spend a fair amount of time in London. In the evenings, I would go to meetups. You just talk to random people that you were sitting next to, or before or afterwards, and you just practice sort of talking to people, and you have no idea whether they're going to have this problem, and
right.
you're slowly discovering whether they have the problem that you're interested in, and if
Right.
they don't, doesn't matter. You can still have a conversation about other things.
So from a sort of personal skills perspective, it does require you to talk to strangers, which we're all told not to do as children. But now, crucially, this isn't about selling at this point, is it? And maybe that's a good thing because that's not quite so daunting, right?
Yeah, you're basically you're interviewing people to see whether this what the problem that you're trying to solve is something that they experience, and you're trying to get closer and closer to people who do experience that problem. So at no point should you ever go into selling mode, right? Because that early on, it's about trying to solve, finding out whether they have that problem, how big the problem is, how much time does it take, does it cost them anything? So it's effectively research. It's research on the problem.
And if you did try to sell or pitch to them at that point, what's likely to go wrong? What would happen? What would you miss out on?
Well, most people are not, especially strangers. They'll never be rude to you. They'll say, "Oh, yeah, that's a nice idea," and that's it. You know, it'll just be glib comments that actually don't get you anywhere. I mean, maybe they'll make you feel good, but in reality, you want real data.
Right.
You want well, first of all, you want to get to people who have that problem,
Yeah.
and then once you get to them, you find out how deep that problem is, um, and what current solutions they use to fix it, and all those things. But it's
Yeah.
very much based on historical evidence, right? There's
And
no,
right.
yeah,
So the historical side of things. Now that's really crucial to this technique is because if you ask people about something in the future, or indeed try and sell something to them, you're inviting people to give you lip service, right? To give you an answer you might want to hear because they don't want to offend you. And that lip service can go either way, can't it? They could tell you to get lost, but secretly they quite like your thing. Or more often they'll say, yeah, that's nice, so as not to offend you, right? But it's really important to be talking about their lives prior to now, yeah?
yeah, it's you have to base it on very historical things that they've done to try and overcome this problem. Or if they, sometimes you'll come across people who don't know they have that problem, and they'll interview you about how, you know, what the problem is,
Yeah,
because they probably haven't experienced it. They've probably experienced it, but haven't known they've experienced it. So they end up interviewing you about how does it manifest itself, etc., to see whether it occurs in their lives. And that's good too, because they ask you quite tough questions when they get into it, and it's having to, it's forcing you to actually come up with, to think about the problem from their point of view, and try and see whether how much it will affect them. So
right. And because you're not selling, ideally, this is an exercise that's very much about listening, and that's the whole sort of theme of it, isn't it?
Right.
Is to be listening. And I mean, I suppose you could pitch something at the end of a conversation if you really had something to sell, but that's kind of not really the point of it, is it?
Yeah, that's not really the point. And in fact, once a conversation gets going, I mean, eventually, because you're talking about that problem, you eventually, way down the line, start talking about, ways to solve this,
Yeah.
and discussing the options and stuff like that. And so by then, they've probably realized that this is what you're doing anyway.
Yeah,
So
sure.
um,
But the format is such that they didn't feel like they were under pressure to get a checkbook out or whatever.
right, yeah.
Yeah. Now you used an important phrase there. You described it as a conversation. Now clearly, if you just had a completely random conversation, you might go off at a complete tangent and not get anything useful whatsoever. Is there a good sort of guide for how kind of formalized or what the things you want to know from those people should be before you go talking to people, so that you do at least have a, I was going to use the word script, but that's perhaps too strong a word for it. Is it a good idea to have some sort of list of killer things you want to tackle or at least address in those conversations?
At the back of my mind, yeah, but I'll never force the conversation to go there.
Right.
It will naturally go there if it can.
Right.
So initially, you're just concentrating on the actual problem or the need and how it affects their lives currently.
Yeah.
I try not to lead them to a place. It's better if they go there themselves.
Got you. So this is kind of like the antipathy of sending somebody a survey. And I mean, I've seen a lot of rookie startup founders. They want to do some customer research. They've got they've got half a day to do it, and they get on SurveyMonkey or something and do a survey where there are set questions, sort of yes, no, don't know, good, bad, okay, rubbish sort of thing. What happens if you try to do customer development via surveys, or what doesn't happen?
I mean, those particular questions, you're not really getting good data. It's just people, ticking. Ideally, you want to discuss the actual problem themselves. How, in the past, um, have you experienced this problem? How did it manifest itself, etc. Rather than, is this idea any good, or is this product something you'd be interested in?
Got you. So probably the most important thing to look at, I guess, and what the Mom Test book goes into in much detail, is some examples of some good and bad questions to ask. And I think you just asked one of the worst ones ever. I wondered if we could go through, if you've got some archetypal questions that people ask that are good and some that are bad, and talk about why those are good or bad.
Yeah, so I've got a list of them here. So is this a good idea? That's a really bad question. Is it something you think you'll buy? Because if you ask something a hypothetical, then they may just fob you off and say, yeah, it's something I might buy. It's
So
not really
they're giving you a
concrete.
hypothetical response, in fact, aren't they? Because they might buy it and they might like it, but
Yeah. So yeah, do you like it? Or how much would you pay for this? All of those are theoretical. So all of those things are really bad. You should instead just look at specific instances in the past where they've actually had this problem, and how have they overcome it? Maybe they tried to overcome it themselves, or they looked for a service and couldn't find anything and just let the problem be, or all those things, all those historical things, and how they've reacted to
okay.
that need.
So the killer thing really is about asking about past tense sort of questions about what you did or what you were frustrated with, and never asking about what you plan on doing or what you might do, because that can't be guaranteed and can't be trusted. However, honest the person might be, they don't necessarily know what they're going to be doing tomorrow. That's the killer one, isn't it?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. It's hard to know whether they will ever buy something. You definitely sometime down the line you can have that conversation about what your solution is and stuff like that. But initially, it's a bad idea to do that, because you want good data. You want something useful that you can collate from many people and work out whether this idea that you have has legs or not.
right. Okay. So so I think you've touched on another really important thing there is in terms of the numbers of conversations you need to be having, and what you're looking for. What's the signal? What's the needle moving in that customer development process, and how many people might you need to be talking to see that needle move?
I think you know early on. So when you talk to people and you find people who you find enough people who have that problem, because maybe a lot of people that you talk to don't have that problem, but and um, and so you have to keep on looking. Now, if you keep on looking and don't find anyone, or just find a few people who have that, it really narrows the market, and you have to make a decision at that point whether this is a worthwhile thing or not. Um, Now, it just so happens that I happen to be in cybersecurity, and of course, everyone knows that cybersecurity is important, etc. But most people you talk to just don't care, right? They basically say, well, you know, I'm not. I know about privacy and security and all that, but actually, I'm happy with whatever it is I'm doing. So, so even though you may have an idea to solve something that you know everyone has that problem, you have to figure out how much they're willing to actually, or in the past, how much they've tried to overcome that problem.
Right.
And security and cybersecurity in general affects everyone. But I know from experience, it's really rare that you find a person who says, "Yeah, I'm really tight on my cyber hygiene, etc."
So it's a bit like trying to sell rocket science or nuclear physics to somebody. It may affect their lives through things they don't even realize, but that's and whether they recognize it in their own lives and want to buy something in relation to it's a completely different matter. I guess in terms of those conversations, you have to make a call on whether, if say only 10% of the people you speak to show an interest or appear to have had your problem, you have to make a call. It could still be a very high value market. It's just smaller than you thought. There are less people, but maybe they'd pay more. Or it could be telling you that the whole premise of it is bogus and should be moved on from, sort of thing.
Yeah. So when you talk to people and you find out why they're interested, or if they've dealt with that problem, you have to dig in to find out why they actually took those steps. Because it's certainly in terms of cybersecurity, most people just don't bother. And so once you've met people who have taken additional steps to improve their security, then you find out why. What's the thing that drove them, and so you're slowly learning about the actual things that they think about to take those steps. And then if you learn that, I don't know, maybe parents with kids that are where they've just given them the first phone, maybe they're worried about the certain aspects of security there, and so maybe that's a driver, right? And so if you work out that I guess these days people give the kids get their first phone when they're, I don't know, 10, something like that, maybe 11. So you then start looking for people who have kids where they've just given them a phone, right? And you talk to them to see whether they care about this problem or not.
That example throws up a really interesting one about making sure you're actually talking to the customer as opposed to somebody who might in fact be a user. That same issue with Google. We think ourselves as Google users, but we're actually part of the products, aren't we? So
That's right, yeah.
if you interviewed, in the case of the example you've just given, if you interviewed the children rather than the parents, you might get a very, very different response. And the same could not the same apply if you were trying to sell to enterprise. If you're not having the customer development conversations with the person who makes the decision, or indeed the person who's close to the buying sort of process, you're potentially getting lip service, even though they might be very excited about what you're doing. You're potentially getting lip service without realizing, because you're talking to the wrong person. Is that right?
Yeah, so actually you raise another thing, because a lot of people that in startups, they think, well, I want to go and talk to the CEO, or to, depending on the problem, they want to go talk to the top person, the CFO, CMO, whatever. And typically that's the wrong approach. You want to find the person who really has the problem lower down, who has to deal with this issue. And it's typically not the person at the top. And then once you've reached that person, you can talk to them about how big the problem is, how difficult it is to overcome. You're essentially working out whether what you're trying to do has any value. It's only way after that that you then can go and talk to the CEO, or the stakeholder, or the payer, to then say, you have this problem. It's you're losing this much money, or you're taking on these risks. But initially, if you go and talk to the CEO, they won't have a clue how big that problem is within their company, because they won't have visibility on that.
So perhaps in that scenario where you're selling to a multifaceted company, or a hierarchical company, your customer development conversation, again, without actually heading into proper sales territory, but part of that might be about trying to understand their hierarchy and finding out who would actually authorize this, and who might purchase it, even though you're not asking them to buy there and then. Is that something you could do during customer development?
Yeah, so it's slightly different, because although you're trying to find the person whose responsibility is to fix that problem, or overcome that problem, or deal with that problem, in any company there are lots of stakeholders, and so the purchase decision right at the end is made by many people. That the procurement has a say, maybe legal has a say, customer service has a say. So whatever solution eventually that you want to put forward to them, there are many stakeholders, and you have to think about what all those other departments may think about your solution. In how does it affect them, if it does affect them in any way. And yes, you do have to talk to them, but you can't really talk to them about the same problem. You have to talk about their view of, if you're talking to, I don't know, the CFO, for example, they're probably more interested in value for money rather than the actual fix to the problem. So you're then having a very different conversation to them about what you're trying to do.
Okay, good. So just going back to the sort of appropriate questions to ask, and obviously, I mean, the mum test is got really loads of really good examples, but are there some classic killer questions that probably apply to most situations, most businesses doing early stage customer development, something that, or variations of which, most people should be asking?
That's a tough one, because so the first thing you have to do is, whenever you talk about that, when you're talking to other people, is you have to make it about them, right? That's the most important thing. A lot of people take this view that they want to say things, but that's the wrong approach. You have to think about the person you're talking to, and their lives, their working lives, so to speak, whether they have that problem. And so whatever it is you want to say, shouldn't really come into it.
Right. So yet again, it's the antipathy of being a fast buck salesperson. It's more like almost being a counselor and having him on the couch and saying, well, okay, what troubled you this week or last year when you did this sort of thing, right?
Well, I guess it's. I mean, you don't ask totally open-ended questions. You do guide them to a particular area so that you can have a discussion about this. But at the end of the day, you're trying to find out what their experience of that area is, and it's it could be to do with their private lives or their working lives. And they may not have that problem. So you're asking questions to slowly hone in on the area that you're interested in, or that the area that problem covers.
Right.
But you have no idea whether they have that problem. So it's hard to say that there's definitely a good question to ask. It's you just have to find out. You have to just make it about them, and so you should be guided by their experiences and what they do.
Is there any suggestions you can come up with regarding the initial approach, when however you do it, whether it's a cold call or an introduction? Because presumably that first approach where you're soliciting that conversation could also fall foul of the mum test, because it could look like you're trying to sell something. So is there a good way of wording your intro email or whatever it is that's making it clear that this isn't going to be a sales thing?
Okay, so if it's an email, that I assume it's a cold email, then it's quite different, because you're not really having a conversation. You're presenting something. But even then, it shouldn't be about your product. It should be about the problem. And there, I guess you would directly ask, do you have this particular problem? And you would name that problem.
So you might say, might you say, I'm researching a business idea related to this. I wondered if I could trouble you for some time to discuss that.
Yeah,
something like that.
We're collecting data, and it's a survey based on the research. I think these days that's happening less often. Ideally, you want to call someone, you want to talk to somebody, because
I'm not
that
suggesting
conversation is.
I'm not suggesting you have the whole conversation by email. Far from it. But that soliciting that first conversation, you might do by LinkedIn or email or anything like that, right? And wording in that such a way that they're not immediately saying no to you is presumably quite important.
Yeah. I guess it's you have to basically lead them to talk about a specific area, and yeah, you're just gathering data on how big that problem is. But even if it's a cold email, you want it eventually to become a conversation over the phone, say.
Yeah.
But I don't do that that often. I guess the way I tend to do it now, it's either meetups where I'll talk about a particular area that I'm involved in, and it's just chat. It's just random chat when you meet a stranger, and they'll typically ask each other sort of what area they work in, etc. And then you just have a general conversation about that topic. And it may be that you never end up going to talk about that problem that you're interested in finding out, whether they have that. And sometimes you do. So it really, don't try and force a conversation down a particular path.
We've had a question linked to that, Ben.
Go for it.
In the chat. So kind of building on that, how could you replicate your meetup strategy in a COVID world? Anything to add there? Obviously, with things being online, the etiquette around approaching people perhaps in an event like this.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, I have done sort of conversations recently surrounding this, but because it's not a random meetup like this, it's because you can't, unless that you can go to a breakout room and have individual conversations. It's more to do with using your network. So you start reaching out to people in your network to discuss things, and then if you know that they don't have that problem, maybe they know people who do, and they'll just forward you on. They'll introduce you to other people in their network who are closer to that problem. And then I will have a Zoom call with that person. But even then, it wouldn't be about selling. It's basically you're doing research on that problem space.
So it does sound like using your network and sort of leveraging that is quite significant and is often the best way, because presumably you're going to get introductions are always going to be better than completely cold approaches, aren't they?
Yeah, definitely.
Sure.
And because I mean, although I have attended a fair number of Zoom meetups, it's really hard. You can't just talk to one person randomly, right? Because everyone, it's one communication channel. And I guess you could see the list of people and reach out to them afterwards. That's a possible way of doing it.
I guess virtual things has made, it's kind of taken away the informality that where the most sort of useful serendipitous things happen. If I think about the events that I might have run a year and a half ago, obviously you have the formal talk at the beginning, but it's when everybody's stopped, you know, when the formality stopped and everyone is standing around or they move to the coffee shop or pub, that's when the really important stuff happens, and that's when the really important conversations happen, either between the presenter and the audience, or between audience members, and that's been kind of taken away from us a little bit, hasn't it? It's made that much more difficult.
Yeah.
Sam, do we have any other questions? That looks like there's one or two that are quite good.
Yeah. So, oh yeah, do you? I think you've touched on this already. Do you think it's a good idea to segment? Oh, where's that gone? Do you think it's a good idea to segment potential customer types early, or focus on one persona only?
Okay, so yeah, so this is a common question. You should not focus on one persona early, because you're making too many assumptions about whether that's a valid persona or not. You should go as broad as possible and slowly weed out the ones where you know they definitely don't have. You shouldn't make assumptions. There've been a number of startups where they've made assumptions about who their customers are, and it ended up not being, you know, they ended up sort of finding customers in elsewhere. Now, I know within the startup ecosystem, you're supposed to, you know, go down to a niche and then find your tribe, or whatever you want to call it. But initially, you have to go broad, and then as you learn, you can narrow it down. As you learn them, or as you learn more, you can identify 3 or 4 customer segments, and you just concentrate on those 4. But eventually, you want to get down to 1, and then you can just concentrate on that. Hopefully, it'll be the biggest one, the most important one. And then you can tailor your questioning and your messages down to that one. But initially, you go broad.
I've had personal experience of that, because one of our products, Participol, which is an audience polling solution, was invented by a mathematics lecturer at University of Leicester, and we all assumed that because he was using it and his colleagues liked it, he just sort of done a demo version of it. We all assumed that academics would be the primary users. But when we started putting it out there and letting people sort of try it for free, and indeed when people started buying it, it was apparent that whilst there were some academics using it, the real segment that was motoring was healthcare and pharmaceutical people and sort of training people, and completely different segment. And we had no prior vision of that whatsoever. And I think if we decided, you know, made that presumption that it was just you know, for academia, yeah, we probably would have had some sales, but probably only like a quarter of what we've got now, just because we started with a very open mind as to who might like it. So that was certainly a powerful thing we learned very early on.
Yeah, I guess that's why within customer development, the first phase is called customer discovery, where you're trying to discover your customers, and you should go broad as possible. And again, don't try and concentrate on talking to the top people at a company. You need to find within the company people who actually are dealing with this problem, if it's a B2B solution.
that's exactly what we find. It's the people doing training within a pharmaceutical company, and that's not necessarily the CEO at all. And the CEO might never do training, or if they did, it was years ago. So, I don't know if we properly answered the one about replicating sort of meetup strategy and such like in a COVID world. It is clearly more difficult, but presumably this is where networks and communities just become all that more powerful, don't they? And doing it that way, right?
Yeah, going to sort of online meetups, trying to meet people there. I have so more recently, maybe in the past month, I have attended sort of sessions, and I'm trying to remember the name of the website, but it's different formats for Zoom meetings, where it's more of a 3D game where you're an avatar and you have
Have you've been on chat roulette again, Dave?
yeah, it's not called chat roulette, but you're in a room, and you can see all the other people, and you can just wander around and talk to them. So it's trying to replicate that informal sort of thing that you get for real life meetups.
Given you're in that very situation right now and you're doing customer development, have you perhaps at the moment been doing more of that via either direct cold calls or emails than you might have done a year ago, sort of thing? Or
yeah, no, I mean, we're still really early. I mean, we're still really early in our journey. So at the moment, we're just using our network. I guess we're now on to the next level. So one hop away. So everyone that we've spoken to recently has been someone that we've been referred to.
And are you still at the point where you could very easily radically change the course of your business depending on those conversations? Because one of the things I've noticed, and the same excuse me, same applies when people are doing marketing, is often people go away and spend 6 months building something and then say, right, now we need to do some marketing. And that actually the same would apply. That would be a bad idea. And the same would apply with customer development. If you do that, well, it's not the end of the world, but you might end up tearing everything up and almost starting from scratch if the results you got weren't expected.
Yeah, so I guess we've been doing customer development for maybe just over a month, and we did switch after about 2 weeks. We did not pivot entirely, but we did change the emphasis or tweak the problem space differently, and that's gotten much better response.
So how many people have you spoken to so far?
Oh, maybe 24.
Right.
So yeah, it's
and that's already beginning to show, you're beginning to see a needle move, albeit perhaps in a slightly different direction from what you anticipated.
Yeah, to some extent, yes. I think we're still early in that journey, so we're still moving towards people who really have that problem. So I guess the first, we've spoken to our direct contacts, and then they've referred us to the next layer, so to speak, and we're getting closer to people who really have that problem. But I don't think we're there yet. We've probably been introduced to organizations that definitely have that problem, but not to the person dealing with that problem.
Right, so you're actually, and it's an important stage which I guess maybe people would overlook, is this idea of, before you're even doing the direct conversations with the target people, is prospecting, really, isn't it? But again, not for sales conversations, but prospecting so that you can, via your various degrees of separation, you can end up talking to the right person, and that's a big part of it before you even have a single real customer conversation.
Yeah, but you have to bear in mind that even those initial conversations, well, we're still trying to discover whether they have the problem.
Right. So they might surprise you, and the first person you talk might be bang on, and you didn't realise it. But equally, they might be another degree of separation away from a hit,
yeah.
as it were.
And we don't know. We don't make any assumptions when we first talk to them about whether they have this problem or not, because because although we know them quite well, we don't actually know their day-to-day working life. So yeah, so you do have to sort of bear in mind that you need those referrals, and you're trying to get closer and closer to the people who have that problem. Great.
Sam, I think you were going to...
Yeah, no, so just to circle back to the COVID one again, I remember a couple of our accelerator participants from the November cohort talked about Lunch Club. They found that a really useful, I think it's lunchclub.ai, I might have got that wrong around. So yeah, just to throw that out as a suggestion for interesting conversations with potentially very relevant or highly skilled individuals in your across all sorts of sectors.
Are there any other questions we've got up on Uni?
Yeah. So when asking a question via email to facilitate a Zoom conversation later on, this is more of sort of advice. No, there is a question. Is it a good idea to also introduce yourself in detail? If so, how to avoid that sounding too markety?
I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think that you should introduce yourself or the company. Yeah, because you should basically say that you're investigating this area or you're doing research, but you don't necessarily have to talk about yourself or the company.
Would you explicitly say, this isn't a sales call and I won't be selling anything? Is that a good part of your sort of...
Not really, and I don't think I've ever said that, but if I do a cold email, it will be directly about the problem. Right. Even the heading would be about the problem. It could be just as blatant as, do you have you suffered, a hacking attempt in the last year? Or I mean, that's probably, but you would basically think about the problem that you're trying to solve and come up with questions that directly relate to that problem. Right. And then but I actually know of a few startups who they do their primary outreach is via email, and they do campaigns, 2 campaigns a week, right? So they'll do A/B testing, different questions, and they'll slowly tweak questions over the course of months, and see how people respond. Do they click on the link to go through to find more data? So there's so that whole growth hacking side of things. It's that's a totally different subject, but it is based on and the example of the company I can think of is initially they were pitching themselves as a company, etc., and they slowly morphed into asking direct questions about the problem and almost looking as if they were researchers rather than a company selling something.
I think I've had an example of that actually. So we had somebody approach us about our co-working space, but it turned and it was, we're really interested in it, and it turned out actually they were trying to sell broadband to us, but they actually hijacked my sympathy to customer development interviews. I thought, yeah, it's a startup, of course I'll take the call. By the end of it, they had no interest in co-working whatsoever, and were trying to pitch broadband to me, which was great, but complete waste of time in that instance. So yeah, nice try. Tell me about, earlier you were talking about kind of digging in and getting to the bottom of what people's pain points are. And I was reminded of, I don't know if this is facetious or whether people really do this, but you know the technique they call the 5 whys. Is that real, or is that, if it is, do you want to talk a bit about that?
Okay, so when you dig that deep, especially the 5 whys, it can be a bit annoying. So when you talk to customers, it's if you're constantly asking, why do you do that, or then yeah, you certainly don't want to go there. Or you can talk about their actions, as long as it's based on their actions and maybe their decision process, but asking why is really.
Well, you could end up sounding like a 4-year-old just demanding something, I suppose. So maybe the spirit of the 5 whys is good, because it says keep digging, and if they reveal anything in the last answer, go, okay, I'm interested. You said that. What did you mean by it? That's polite, right? Isn't it? That's okay. That's healthy digging, yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing is, it's probably good to way up front to say how long this conversation is going to be for. I'm going to be, this is going to last 10 minutes. So if you do start digging like that, then they'll know, okay, he's pushing me into a space where I don't really want to go, but I know there's only 2 minutes left. So, okay, I'll go there.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, you do have to be careful how deep you dig.
We have 11 minutes left. So I think, Sam, is there one more?
Yeah. So if all of your customers have asked you for a specific development, what questions or conversations would you then have with them?
Sorry, say the beginning part again.
So if your customers, if all of your customers have asked you for a specific development, what questions or conversations would you then have with them? So I guess this is framed in the context of these folks are buying from you already, rather than potential customers.
Okay, so they're asking you to develop a specific feature. Is that the gist?
Yeah, perhaps if you've got customers, you're iterating. You still do customer development once you've built your product. But then they've identified a particular thing that they like that you haven't got, a feature perhaps. So what are the sort of questions or conversations, I mean, this is my interpretation, would you then have with them?
Okay, so I guess that wouldn't really be classed as customer development. That's more product management. So and so it's a later phase thing. It's so in that particular case, you have to judge whether this is the right thing for you to do or not. You then can issue a survey to the rest of your customers to see whether this is a good idea. Now, it may be that because there's 2 things that could happen. One, it's an extra feature or an option that is optional for your users, or it's something that all your users will have to accept because it's like a change in screen and so if they want to change in the way the workflow happens and it affects all your customers, then obviously you will need to talk to all your customers beforehand.
I guess that raises an interesting point about when, if ever, do you stop doing customer development? Because of course, if you've already built something and you're getting sales and it's beginning to maybe get some traction, that doesn't mean that you stop doing customer development, right? But do you perhaps do it slightly differently?
Well, going back to the start, I remember that customer development is 4 phases, right? So I guess if you're continually doing customer development, and whereas the MUM test is typically to do with customer discovery. But once you've moved on to the next step, which is customer validation, where you've honed in on the types of segments that you're interested in, and you're trying to dig deep into that particular segment. So in that particular case, it becomes really targeted. Maybe you're cold calling or using your networks to approach customers in that particular segment that you're after. And then if that comes back positive, then you're into the next phase, which is customer creation, where you literally change all your marketing and all your emphasis for your product to tailor that segment. You become very specific, and you're trying to make sure that everyone within that segment hears about you and hopefully become your customers. And then after that is phase 4, which is customer growth, and there you then start branching out. But that third phase, the customer creation bit, you do listen to what they have to say, but you do want to make sure that everybody wants, if it affects everybody, then you get feedback from everybody, and it could just be a survey that you send out.
So in a sense, once you're up and running, it's less critical in that respect. But presumably, you could have been running for 5 years, and you could still use customer development techniques to test the water for, say, a new feature or an add-on product or something like that.
Yeah, or typically you would use customer development or customer discovery, the early phases, for new market segments. So you've established yourself in a particular segment, and now you're moving into a next segment where you think your product suits. Now that next segment could be a different slice of the population, or it could be a new country, right? It's not necessary that it's a particular a new segment within with a different profile. It could be regionally different. So yeah.
Cool. Thinking about Steve Blank and the mum test, are there any other key areas of the customer development process that you think we've not covered or missed? Have we covered everything? What's that one thing I should have asked you that will come to me in 5 minutes' time when we hang up?
Well, the whole thing about lean methodology is that you've probably heard the terms, pivot, fail fast, all those things, product market fit. So product market fit is typically at the end of the second phase. So it's the end of the customer validation phase. So although we've spoken about customer development, it's very closely tied to lean startup. And so, and including business model canvas or the lean canvas, whichever one you want to use, all those things are tied into that.
And going back to the pitfall that perhaps rookie founders fall into of spending far too long building something before they even have conversations. Presumably, there's nothing wrong with building things at some point, but you should only be doing it in reaction to valid information, right? And so, can the sort of cadence of doing this be build a bit, listen a bit, build a bit, or is customer development really always something that you do before you touch, let's say, a line of code or make the thing?
I guess that's where the concept of MVP comes along.
Yeah,
you build it a little bit, you spend a month or whatever building a prototype, so that when you eventually talk to customers and you get into the problem, you can then show your prototype, your MVP, to see whether there's any value in it. Is this a worthwhile thing?
So the MVP, so a good MVP would be a sort of company owner's response to good customer development. Whereas a bad one would be purely just based on their speculation or assumptions that they've made. Because it's one of the things I feel like I've seen so often, especially with first timers, and I know I've been guilty of myself, is to kind of fall in love with a business idea and to go away and spend ages making this beautiful thing that may or may not be of any use to anybody whatsoever.
Okay, so you raise a really important thing. So lean startup and customer development is you make a hypothesis about something and then you go out and validate it, right? Whereas traditionally the previous approach would be you design thinking, which is you go and talk to the users, find what problems they have, and then try and come up with solutions. So in many ways, customer development is the opposite. It is you come up with something first, and then you go and validate it. But the whole point about it is that make sure you come up, you do an MVP, which is not this huge thing you spent millions trying to build. It's a tiny experiment. You go out and you test it out. But you do, so lean startup is all about you come up with an idea, you build a small prototype or an MVP, and then you go and validate it. So the idea comes first. Whereas design thinking, which is the more traditional approach, is you go and talk to users first, find their problems, and then come up with a solution.
Right. The world is awash with methodologies and stuff, and I guess they all come from different industries and different sort of nuance. But it obviously customer development is the right one for potentially scalable startups. Yeah. Cool.